Today, I just want to share a few insights from the text Introduction to Black Studies by Maulana Karenga in light of Black History Month. Today, I want to engage in a conversation around the legacy of Booker T. Washington and why I believe that Booker T. Washington was so misunderstood. There's a chapter or section in the Black History section of Karenga's text entitled Accommodationism, Confrontation, and Black Nationalism. Today, we want to unpack the label that has been attached to Booker T. Washington as an accommodationist. But I want you to notice what Karenga observes in the text, and we'll get into this in this lecture. Karenga says, Washington's policy of accommodation was contradicted by his private efforts against racism. He was deeply involved in the struggle against disenfranchisement and other forms of discrimination. He not only lobbied in the background against disenfranchisement and other forms of discrimination, he also raised money to pay lobbyists and fight court cases against racism. Moreover, he was for Black economic power and built the National Negro Business League to advance Black economic interests. And then Karenga also points out, and let me find it here, that W.E.B. Du Bois, who was often viewed as an opponent or a rival of Booker T, Karenga observes that Du Bois once complimented Washington's practical achievement in open. And he complimented Washington's behind-the-scenes efforts against racism and oppression. So now let's study this together. When we talk about Black history, one of the quiet dangers is how easily we reduce complex leaders into a single moment. Not only to a single moment, but to a single speech, a single phrase, a single label. For many people, this is exactly what happened to Booker T. Washington. Mention his name, and almost immediately the phrase accommodationist follows. The 1895 Atlanta Exposition speech becomes the whole story. And once that label is applied, the conversation often stops. He is cast as an overly cautious, politically quiet, and even complicit Black leader. But I want to slow that story down because history deserves more patience than that. And our ancestors, shall I say, deserve more honesty. What if that label doesn't actually describe Booker T. Washington at all? What if it tells us more about how later generations judged him than about how he actually lived and led? And what if a better word, one that fits both the evidence and the context, is this: strategic realist. Strategic realist. To understand why that matters, we have to remember the world Washington was navigating. This was not the hopeful Reconstruction moment. That window had already slammed shut. Federal protection for Black life had been withdrawn. Lynching was not rare, it was public, ritualized, and unpunished. Black schools were burned, Black businesses were destroyed, Black political participation was systemically dismantled. In that world, leadership was not an abstract moral exercise, it was a survival practice. So when Booker T. Washington spoke carefully, the question is not why wasn't he louder? Why did he seem to reach for white comfort? The real question is what was at risk had it been otherwise? What was the risk if he had been louder? The term accommodationist assumes something important that Washington agreed or was simply willing to go along with segregation or accepted white supremacy as legitimate. But the historical record does not support that assumption. Washington never argued that segregation was just. He never claimed it was permanent. He never taught that black people were inferior or should remain subordinate. What, what he argued, pardon me, over and over again was that black people were living in a moment where reckless confrontation could lead to catastrophic loss of life, loss of schools, loss of economic footholds that had taken decades to build. That is not ideological agreement, that is situational realism. A strategic realist tells the truth about power as it actually as it actually exists, pardon me, not as we wish it were. A strategic realist chooses methods that protect life and institutions. A strategic realist plays the long game when the short game could cost everything. Washington's primary question was never what sounds morally pure. His question was what keeps black people alive and advancing right now. This perspective shows up clearly when we look at his 1895 speech, but we look beyond it. What happened after that speech? Washington believed deeply in economic power, not as an end in itself, but as a form of protection. He believed ownership created leverage, skill created mobility, institutions created permanence. He once argued that the ability to earn a dollar mattered because it shielded black families from immediate vulnerability. Not because politics were unimportant, but because politics without protection was fragile and easily revoked. And history proved him right. Voting rights were stripped away, federal promises disappeared, but black schools like Tuskegee remained. Black businesses endured. Black leadership pipelines continued forming, quietly, steadily, stubbornly. This was not retreat, this was infrastructure. What complicates the accommodationist label even further is what Washington did behind the scenes. Things most textbooks barely mention. He quietly funded legal challenges to segregation. He supported black newspapers that directly criticized racial injustice. He condemned lynching publicly, using language calibrated to be heard without triggering immediate retaliation against black institutions. He once stated, the Negro does not desire special favors. Pardon me, let me say that again. The Negro does not require special favors. The Negro requires justice. This is important to say clearly. Silence is not the same as consent. Washington understood that open confrontation from his position could shut down Tuskegee overnight. So he chose what many oppressed communities have always chosen, dual discourse. One voice for white power structures, another voice for black survival and black futures. That is not weakness, that is survival intelligence. Write that down. That is survival intelligence. And this is where comparisons with W.E.B. Du Bois often become unfair. History forced us into a false choice: Washington or Du Bois, accommodation or resistance, pragmatism or prophecy. Du Bois offered prophetic clarity, moral urgency, intellectual confrontation. He named the injustice plainly and demanded immediate transformation. Washington offered institutional preservation, strategic patience, incremental power building in a hostile environment. One named the fire, the other made sure there was something left standing after it. They were not enemies in purpose, even if they differed in method. And the survival of Black communities required both voices at the same time. There's also a theological dimension to this that often goes unspoken. If we read Washington through a Black theological lens, he looks less like a compromiser and more like a wisdom figure. Less Amos, more Joseph. Less Elijah, more Daniel. Less street prophecy, more court survival. Joseph worked within Pharaoh's system without endorsing Pharaoh's theology. Daniel served in Babylon without surrendering his identity. Esther navigated power without announcing revolt. Not every faithful response to oppression is loud. Some are patient. Some are strategic. Some are designed to preserve life long enough for freedom to become possible. Washington practiced what might be called preservation theology in an age of terror. He cannot, rather shall I say, he understood that you cannot liberate a people who've been wiped out. And you cannot educate a people whose schools have been burned to the ground. That doesn't make him perfect, it makes him human, and it makes him complex. Understand Washington in terms of his positionality as a chess player rather than a checkers player. Washington might be better understood in terms of uh, showing us how ownership creates protection, skills create mobility, and institutions create permanence. He did not reject civil rights. He was trying to make institutions survivable. We view him not only as a strategic realist, but also an institutional pragmatist, an incremental liberationist, a survival-oriented nationalist, and an economic Black nationalist. The biblical witness reminds us that faithfulness is not monolithic. Not every moment calls for Amos standing in the street naming judgment. Some moments require wisdom, some require patience, some require strategy. Washington's leadership belongs to that tradition. Not prophetic silence, but calculated preservation. Not moral surrender, but disciplined restraint shaped by the question, How do we keep our people alive long enough for justice to have a future? If we only honor one kind of resistance, the loud, visible, confrontational kind, we risk misunderstanding the full tradition that made survival possible. Black History Month should not be about flattening our ancestors into heroes or villains. It should be about letting them be real, strategic, conflicted, wise, constrained, courageous in ways that don't always look the same. So maybe the task is not to defend Booker T. Washington, and it's not to condemn him either. Maybe the task is to let go of a label that no longer fits. Accommodationist closes the conversation. Strategic realist opens it. And history gets truer when we allow complexity to speak.